The book of Psalms has 150 chapters. It's more like a 150 poetic writings, and they serve different purposes and they were written under different conditions, and they form the basics or the building block of Israel's hymn book. It has elements of songs or praise in it. You're welcome to another episode of Logos, where our hearts are transformed by the revelation of Christ. This is a walk through the Psalms, episode 2. In the previous episode, we looked at various modes through which God communicated through the Bible writers. And we look at a very important text in Hebrews 1, verse 1, how that God at various times and in various ways has spoken to the fathers by the prophet, and in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son Jesus. We explored a little more the various ways through which God spoke to the Bible writers and through which they communicated the message of the Lord and have it recorded in scriptures. Now, we're going to continue along that same line today, but like I said in the previous episode, we're going to look more at the general introduction to the book of Psalms. We cannot finish it in this episode, so we're going to conclude the general introduction to the book of Psalms in the next episode. Now, going back to what we learned in the previous episode, showing that the mode of communication will determine the mode or the way through which we're going to interpret a book. Now, so we need to find out as we read through Bible books, right from Genesis all the way to Revelation, to see the pattern of communication and the system of communication through which God communicated to these people and how they also put down this message of the Lord. So the literary style will determine how the book will be interpreted. Now, for instance, we said that the books of Moses were in types and shadows. That tells us that most of his writings cannot be interpreted literally. Otherwise, we're going to misinterpret many of his writings. Bible shows it clearly that is in types and shadows. So we're going to see the book of Psalms today, and in looking at the general introduction to the book of Psalms, we're going to consider the poetic style that is used, which it seemed to be more peculiar to the ancient time when the book of Psalms was reading and is common among the Jews. And we're going to just lay that as the foundation so that it can help our understanding, interpretation, and understanding of the book of Psalms. Now, the word Psalms comes from the Greek word psalmoi or psalterion, and the meaning is songs that are sung to the accompaniment of a string instrument. That's what the word psalm means. However, in Hebrews, it means it is actually called tehillim, and it simply means praises or songs of praise. And so, what we can see in the Greek word and the Hebrew word of the literal meaning of Psalms is that it has elements of songs or praise in it. So, summarily, while we were going to see different types of expressions and human experiences in the book of Psalms, the summary of that book is that it is a song of praise. Now, the book of Psalms expresses lamentation, sorrow, complaint, and all kinds of human experiences. But the Hebrew meanings suggest that the ultimate direction of the book is towards the praise of God. The book of Psalms has 150 chapters. It's more like a 150 poetic writings, and they serve different purposes and they were written under different conditions, and they form the basics or the building block of Israel's hymn book. So some of those psalms were literally sung among the Jews. So these psalms, like I said earlier, they are a mix of songs, prayer. So the 150 chapters in the book of Psalms do not just refer to worship only. If you are conversant with the book of Psalms, you will have seen this. So in the 150 chapters, you will see songs, prayers, and various poetic writings that reflect a wide range of human experiences. Now, so it ranges from praise, thanksgiving to lamentation and supplication. You will see various forms of human experiences and emotions in the book of Psalms. Now, they were written by different authors. I mentioned that previously. The book of Psalms were written by different authors, and David is the most prominent contributor. He has over 70 Psalms to his credit. Now, one important thing we need to pay attention to, which will start opening up the book of Psalms to us, is to consider um, the system. Why we have said, no doubt, and we're going to look at some examples in this episode. We have said that the book of Psalms those writings are primarily poetic. They are not straight expressions. Now, when you talk of poems, you're talking about expression statements that are reading with figurative expressions, which don't have literal meanings, except we read it in context and we pay attention to the literary style. Now, the poetic style that is used in the Psalms is peculiar to the Jewish style of writing, and it is called parallelism. So it's a little different from English style of poem, which has more to do with rhymes and meter. I'm going to explain that a little bit as we go on. Now, so I'm saying that the poetic style of the Jews, through which the book of Psalms was written, is called parallelism and is a little bit different from the way the English style of poem is engaged, which is what we English speakers are used to. And so the essence of that that separation or difference is to realize that we cannot use all the rules of interpreting English poetry for the interpretation of biblical poetry. They have some little differences. And in knowing this difference, it will also help us to understand how to interpret the book of Psalms. So ultimately, the Psalms guide believers in worship, no doubt. In spite of the poetic rendition, it guides believers in worship, prayer, and reflection, and they point forward to the Messiah, Jesus Christ. So those are the things we're going to look at. The part that points to the Messiah, we're going to look at that in the next episode. Now, but what is parallelism? Parallelism are lines of poetry that either echo, contrast, or build on each other's meaning rather than focusing on rhyme or meter. What we are saying is now English language use a lot of words that sound in similar way. Now, so words like impression without expression leads to depression. So those are words that sound alike, and that's what we call rhyme. That's just a basic example of rhymes in English language. But the kind of poetry style that is used in the book of Psalms is a little different from that. It's not about how the word sounds, which is more peculiar to English poem. In this case, it has more to do with the harmony of the statement, the poetic statement. So while English poetry system style, which is majorly rhyme and meter, focuses more on how the words sound, the sound of words. The Hebrew parallelism focus on the meanings. Now, that's a striking difference between this style of poetry. Not only that, you will see different style of parallelism also. Now, when we say lines of poems, we are simply saying statements. So what the way it works is an initial statement is made, then the next line we either reinforce the first statement or contrast it, all serving the same purpose. Both whether they use synonymous sentence or expression or they use a contrasting sentence, the whole idea is to drive home a very strong point. So that's the whole idea of parallelism. It's more like a poetic technique. Let me put it this way. It's a way of saying something and then saying it again in a new shade of meaning. That's what parallelism is all about. You have a particular message you're trying to pass across, and you are trying to use different sentences which might be similar at times or contrasting at times, just to drive home the point you're trying to make. So it's actually a very good tool if we approach it well, and we can see that it can help us to meditate deeply on the truth. So in case you miss the point in the first set of sentences, by the time you read down, you will realize that it's repeating that same idea. Another thing it's going to do for us is it will not make us start looking at the book of Psalms as maybe a rendition now, different expressions, and we might be thinking that okay, though these different expressions are in the same context, they are saying the same thing. No, and that is why we must know the literary style and pay attention to it. Now, while generally there are different style of parallelism, I'm going to just mention two, which seem to be the commonest in the book of Psalms, and we're going to move on from there. Now, the first one I want to talk about is synonymous parallelism. In this type, the second line repeats the idea of the first line in a slightly different way. So parallelism, like I said, is a fusion of meaning, not necessarily of statement. So a first line is made, and another line, when I say line, like I said, is I'm talking about statement. So the first poetic sentence is made, many times poetic. Now the next sentence that is made only try to reinforce or repeat the same idea, but not necessarily using the same sentence. All right, so let's look at an example. So it's more of the meaning or the idea that is being passed across. Psalm 24, verse 1, we will see a very good example of that in that Psalm 24, verse 1. Right, the earth is the Lord's and its fullness, the world and those who dwell in it. Now look at that. It said the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness, the world and those who dwell therein. Now, so the second line restates the first in different words. That's exactly what it is. Now, look at it. It said the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. So it has already talked about all the fullness of the heart. And now the second line, also I'm saying that the first line actually that gives us a full meaning actually ends with the word fullness. The earth is the Lord's and its fullness. That's the first line. Now, the second line is the world and those who dwell in it. So that's a synonymous parallelism. Different expressions putting across similar idea. So because the idea here is that everything, the heart and everything in it belongs to God. And the next sentence is saying, now look at it, the word heart used in the first line and the word world used in the second line, they are saying the same thing in this context. The world and those who dwell in them. The fullness of the heart, the world and those who dwell in them, every one of them belongs to the Lord. And so you see similar ideas repeated with two different sentences that follow each other. So the next type of parallelism is antithetical. It's just like the opposite of the synonymous, two contrasting statements. The first one talks about two similar statements passing across the same idea. Now, but here in antithetical parallelism, we are talking about two contrasting lines, better put, with the same idea. Okay, so let's look at an example in Psalm 1, verse 6. Same idea, two contrasting lines. They are trying to pass across the same thing, but they are giving us some contrasting expressions. All right, Psalm 1, let's look at verse 6. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. For the Lord watches over the righteous. Another version says, for the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction. Now, the second line presents an opposite of the contrasting idea. But ultimately, that verse is saying the same thing. How? Okay, he said, for the Lord knows the way of the righteous. God knows the way of the righteous, no doubt. And is still telling us ultimately, he didn't tell us that God does not know the way of the wicked. Okay, so what he's simply saying is that he knows the way of the righteous. Now, when he says he knows the way of the righteous, he's simply saying he's acquainted and involved in the life of a righteous man. And the opposite of that is that if God is not involved in what you're doing and you're living in sin all the days of your life, then you know what the result is going to be. So, same ultimate idea, but with contrasting expressions. So I'm sure that you might need to study more about Jewish poetry to get this. I can only give a blob of what it really means. This is just like a general expression. So you might do well to just do a further study of the book of Psalms very well, and it's going to be clearer to you. Time will not permit me to give more examples, but this is small, just like a teaser to make us go study more. Now, one more thing I want to say before we close this episode is that the book of Psalms is not just poetic, it's also prophetic. The prophetic description will be talked more about in the next episode. But now we cannot say because it is Bible, it is inspired, we close our eyes to the literary style, which is poetic. So most of the writings of the book of Psalms, they are primarily written as poems. Now, some are easily obvious as poems, which might not pose any serious interpretive challenge. But some are subtle. You don't know their poems or except you read patiently and you keep it in the context. And that is why many times it's not a bad idea to check the background and the major reason some of those psalms or the prevailing situation under which some of those psalms are reading. Okay, and so the challenge is this: we will be entering into a grave error if something is presented as a figurative expression and we go ahead to interpret it as a literal expression. Many are falling into this error without knowing, and we glorify such interpretation. And that is why it's good to lay the foundation about the literary style so that we don't continue to repeat the same error over and over again. So some are easily obvious as poetic. Let's look at an example. Psalm 91, verse 4. Poetic expressions are basically figurative expressions which are not direct, and so they have meanings that are deeper than what the words are explaining. And how do you know those deeper meanings? Is by actually reading in context. Is by patiently reading and reading in context. That is when you're going to know that, okay, there's more to it than just the words that are used here. And so let's look at Psalm 91. Psalm 91, verse 4. I know that this might sound a little academic, but it's part of the Bible study. We should have that academic approach in learning scriptures because it's a book that's meant to be read and understood. Okay. Psalm 91, verse 4. He shall cover you with his feathers. Now, this is talking about God. And just right off the bat from verse 4, God does not have feathers. So when you read statements like this, you must pause and consider the meaning. Now, he's using the imagery of a bird, all right? Now, how a bird will shield its chicks or its young from danger. And so we are seeing the comparison there, but he is actually transferring that to the protective ability and power of God. And look at that again, verse 4. He shall cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you shall take refuge. God does not have wings. Okay, his truth shall be your shield and buckler. So you can easily tell that this is poetic, nothing more than that. All right, let's look at an example of some obvious poetic renditions which we should interpret accurately because it's kind of obvious. All right, it's kind of easy to see that this is a poem. This is a figurative expression. Psalm 114, verse 4. Psalm 114, verse 4. The mountains skip like rams, the little hills like lambs. Okay, we have seen situations of earthquake where mountains are shaking, but they are not skipping like rams. This is a poetic expression. Okay, and this verse literally is definitely not meant to be taken literally, otherwise we'll make mistakes. Instead, it's a poetic expression describing the awesome and almost playful movement of creation in response to God's mighty act. So it's not about the mountains skipping, running like animals. That's not exactly what it's saying there. So it's just a powerful picture of how nature itself is portrayed as rejoicing and responding to God's deliverance. That's all there is to that expression. And how do we know that? If we read it in context, we're going to see that. Now let's look at another example of poetic renditions and why we shouldn't interpret these things literally. Psalm 65, verse 13. Psalm 65, verse 13 is going to help us to put some of these things at their right place and interpret them correctly. Now look at it. The pastures are clothed with flocks. The valleys also are covered with grain. They shout for joy. They also sing. I'm sure if you see grass singing, you're not going to stand there. You run. Look at it. He said the pastures are clothed with flocks. That's an interesting poetic rendition, actually. So that means it's saying that the field is filled with flocks, but the way he presented it is that they are clothed with flocks, and the valleys are covered with grain. They shout for joy and sing. Now, this is a figurative expression we can refer to as personification. So the pastures are personified, and the valley as though they are wearing cloth. So that's a poetic rendition, and we should be able to see this easily, because what you want to think about is, okay, look at the objects that are used. Do grass or field actually literally wear clothes? And if they do, how can grass wear animals as clothes? So of course that makes you see that it's not literal, and we shouldn't interpret it literally. Now there are certain other poetic renditions that are not readily obvious. And that is where challenges can come, and that is where we need to pay closer attention. Now, remember where we're coming from. Our foundation is the fact that different times, at different times, through different means, God spoke to this through these people. He spoke to them and spoke through them. And the mode of revelation they received, the mode through which they received the revelation, determined most of the time, if not all the time, how they pen down these revelations. And the way they communicated these revelations from God should determine the way we're going to interpret them. That's the whole idea. And so, because the book of Psalms is primarily rendered as a poetic record or writings, we should pay attention to the details when we study it. And so, there are certain Psalms that are not readily obvious. Psalm 147. There are certain poems, rather, poetic renditions, figurative expressions that are not readily obvious. Let's look at Psalm 147 and look at verse 9. Psalm 147, verse 9. It gives to the beast. Now, the word here is talking about God also. God gives. So we can paraphrase it and say, God gives the beast its food, and the young ravens that cry, rather. Now, so he's saying that the young ravens that cry, he gives them their food. Now, God does not communicate with animals in that sense. We don't have such report that God will wait for them to cry. Now, Bible tells us that in Matthew 6 that they don't need to do anything to be fed. Okay? But here is saying that if we check another version, I'm reading New King James, and New King James says the young ravens that cry. Another version says the young ravens that call. And so literally that word cry in New King James actually is from the Hebrew word that actually means to call. So that's calling, using the word call in human sense. But in a poetic sense, it's only showing God provides for the animals, ravens, and generally his creature. Okay, and so ravens don't need to call God before he provides for them, because that would be, if we interpret it literally that way, it would be contradicting what Bible says in Matthew 6, that they don't need to sow nor gather into barn before God can feed them. So they don't need to call God before he feeds them. Let's look at another example. Psalm 34. Psalm 34. Some things that are not readily obvious uh, as poems in the book of Psalms. Psalm 34, I believe, is a verse of scripture that many of us might be conversant with. Psalm 34, verse 8. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who trusts in him. We don't taste God. We don't. And that's what this place is saying. And it's poetic. It's not a literal thing. How do you taste God? Now, so it's simply a metaphor inviting people to experience God's goodness and his person. So it's more like a relational expression. So he presented having an encounter and experience with God. He presented it as something you could taste and see. So it is a sort of poetic way of talking about experiencing God. That's all he's saying. Nothing more than that. These are poems that are not readily obvious, and if we take them for granted, we might just be missing it. Let me show you one last example before we go. Psalm 98, verse 8. Interesting. I think that is not really subtle. That's readily obvious too. Just you can see tons of examples of poetic expressions in the book of Psalms, but I'm just giving these examples so that we don't get carried away with those expressions and begin to interpret them literally. They should not be interpreted literally. The writers of the Psalms do not intend that they will be interpreted literally. Many of these things are songs. They sang in worship and praise. Some of them are lamentations. Some of them are supplications. Now look at Psalm 98 verse 8. Let the rivers clap their hands. Rivers don't have hands. They don't clap. Look at that. Let hills be joyful together. No. Now, it's just an allusion to what Bible says in Psalm 19 about the heavens declare the glory of God. Now, so when you see such personification expressed in the Psalms this way, now it says once again, let the rivers clap their hands, let the hills be joyful together. Now, these are passive creatures of God, non-living creatures of God that cannot express anything about worship through clapping or anything. The way we can say that the creatures of God are expressing the goodness of God is by when we contemplate these creatures. And so when we take our time to just consider the work of his hand, it will instigate or arouse praise in our hearts to the intelligent and the most wise God. Yeah, that is the whole idea of the heavens talking about the glory of God and his praise. When you look at God's creation, it will excite praise and worship to the Almighty Creator in your heart. That's the whole idea. Look at 19 verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Just by meditating on these things, contemplating them, you're going to see that there is a great and mighty Creator who is our Father God behind this highly structured creation, and that will make you to give him praise. That is the whole idea. So when you read the book of Psalms, don't take it literal. Now, let me tie it up. The whole idea of this discussion is just to prepare your mind, because it's possible that as you go along, some of the things we're going to be explaining is going to come against what I've always believed. And in a bit to create a good foundation, it is important for you to realize that if you have been interpreting those verses literally, then some of the things we're going to be talking about in this series might go against your theology. So get ready. put your house in order. Let's realize that the book of Psalms are predominantly presented as poems, and so we pay attention to how we interpret it. Until I see you in the next episode, I commend you to God and the word of His grace, which is able to build you up and grant you inheritance among them that are sanctified. Amen.